The snow came down in sheets so thick that Clara Zimmerman could barely see her own hands reaching out in front of her, grasping at nothing but frozen air as her brothers rode away without looking back. She screamed after them until her throat burned raw, but the howling wind swallowed her voice whole, and the three figures on horseback disappeared into the white wall of the blizzard like ghosts fading into dawn. Her legs gave out beneath her, and she collapsed into a snowdrift that came up past her knees, the cold seeping through her worn cotton dress and thin shawl with vicious efficiency. This was how she would die, she realized with sudden clarity, abandoned by her own blood in the Arizona high country during the worst winter storm anyone could remember in the year 1881. The events that led to this moment played through her mind in fractured pieces as she tried to stand again, her boots slipping on ice-covered rocks. Their father had died 3 months ago, leaving the small ranch outside Prescott to his 3 sons, Thomas, Michael, and James, with the expectation that they would care for their 20-year-old sister. Instead, they had seen her as a burden, another mouth to feed when cattle prices were dropping and the winter looked to be harsh. She had heard them talking late at night, their voices carrying through the thin walls of the ranch house, discussing how much easier things would be without her. She had not believed they would actually go through with it, not until this morning when Thomas had roughly shaken her awake before dawn and told her to get in the wagon. They had driven for hours into the mountains, claiming they were going to check on a lined shack that needed repairs before the storm hit. Clara had believed them because she wanted to, because the alternative was too horrible to consider. But when they reached this desolate stretch of wilderness, miles from anywhere, Thomas had grabbed her arm and pulled her from the wagon while Michael held the horses steady. James, the youngest at 22, had at least looked troubled, but he had not said a word as Thomas shoved her into the snow and climbed back onto the wagon seat. "Please," Clara had begged, clutching at the wagon's side. "Please do not do this. I am your sister." Thomas had looked down at her with eyes as cold as the storm around them. "We cannot afford you anymore. Maybe you will find your way back, maybe you will not. Either way, it is not our problem." Those had been his last words before he snapped the reins, and the wagon lurched forward, leaving her standing alone in the wilderness with nothing but the clothes on her back, and a storm bearing down with the weight of God's own fury. Now Clara forced herself to move, to put one foot in front of the other, even though she could not feel her toes anymore, and her fingers had gone numb inside her thin gloves. She had to find shelter, had to get out of this wind that cut through her like 1,000 knives. The trees were thick here, ponderosa pines that towered overhead, their branches heavy with snow. If she could find a dense grove, maybe she could huddle among the roots and wait out the worst of the storm. It was not much of a plan, but it was all she had. The world had narrowed to just the next step, and then the next, each one harder than the last. She stumbled over hidden obstacles beneath the snow, fell twice, dragged herself back up both times through sheer stubborn will. Her mother had died giving birth to James, and Clara had been only 5 years old, but she remembered her mother's voice singing lullabies, remembered gentle hands braiding her hair. That woman had been strong, had survived childbirth 3 times before the 4th took her. Clara was her daughter, and she would not give up, would not let her brothers win this easily. But the cold was relentless, and eventually her body began to betray her. Her legs stopped responding properly, and she found herself crawling through the snow, her vision blurring at the edges. She could not tell if she was moving in a straight line or going in circles. The wind screamed in her ears, and the snow piled up around her, threatening to bury her alive. When she finally collapsed face first into a drift and could not summon the strength to rise again. She felt a strange sense of peace wash over her. At least it would be over soon. At least the cold would stop biting at her soon enough. She closed her eyes and thought about summer days at the ranch, about the garden she had tended so carefully, about the apple tree behind the house that bloomed white every spring. She thought about all the things she would never do now, all the life she would never live. 20 years old, and this was how her story ended, frozen in the mountains because her brothers had decided she was not worth the cost of keeping her alive. The sound of hoofbeats broke through the howl of the wind, so faint at first that Clara thought she was imagining it. But it grew louder, more insistent, accompanied by a man's voice calling out words she could not quite make out. She tried to lift her head, tried to respond, but her body would not obey. Strong hands rolled her over, and she found herself looking up into a face framed by a snow-covered hat, dark eyes wide with alarm. "Jesus Christ," the man said, his voice rough with shock. "What are you doing out here? Where did you come from?" Clara tried to answer, but her teeth were chattering too hard to form words. The man did not wait for an explanation. He scooped her up in his arms as though she weighed nothing, and she felt herself being lifted onto a horse, felt the animal's warmth beneath her. The man climbed up behind her, wrapping his heavy coat around both of them, and urged the horse forward. "Hold on," he said close to her ear. "My cabin is not far. You hold on, you hear me?" Clara could not respond, could barely process what was happening. She drifted in and out of awareness as the horse carried them through the storm, the man's arms solid around her, keeping her from falling. Time lost all meaning, seconds stretching into hours or compressing into heartbeats. But eventually she felt the horse stop, felt herself being carried again, and then there was warmth, blessed warmth, as the man kicked open a door and brought her into a small cabin. He laid her on a bed near a pot-bellied stove, and immediately began building up the fire, throwing split logs into the belly of the iron beast until flames roared to life. Then he was back at her side, pulling off her soaked shawl and gloves, examining her hands and feet with careful attention. "Can you feel your fingers?" he asked. "Your toes?" Clara shook her head weakly. The man's jaw tightened and he disappeared from view, returning a moment later with blankets and what looked like strips of cloth. He wrapped her hands and feet gently, then piled blankets on top of her until she was cocooned in warmth. "Your dress is soaked through," he said, his tone matter of fact. "I am going to turn my back and you are going to get it off and wrap yourself in this." He held up a large wool blanket. "Can you do that? Or do you need help?" "I can do it," Clara managed to whisper, though she was not at all sure that was true. But the man nodded and turned away, facing the wall while she struggled out of her wet dress with fumbling fingers. It took forever, every movement an exercise in frustration as her numb hands refused to cooperate, but eventually she managed it and wrapped the blanket around herself. "Done," she said softly, and the man turned back around. He hung her dress near the stove to dry and then brought her a tin cup filled with something hot that smelled of herbs. "Drink this," he instructed. "Slow sips. It will help warm you from the inside." Clara did as she was told, and the liquid burned pleasantly down her throat, spreading heat through her chest. She studied the man as she drank, taking in details she had missed in her earlier confusion. He was probably in his mid-20s, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar and a strong jaw shadowed with stubble. His clothes marked him as a working man, sturdy denim trousers and a flannel shirt, both well worn but clean. A cowboy, she thought, or maybe a rancher. "Thank you," she said when she had finished half the cup. "You saved my life." The man pulled up a wooden chair and sat down, his expression serious. "What were you doing out there?" Nobody goes into the high country in weather like this, not alone and not on foot." Clara felt her eyes fill with tears, and she looked away, ashamed. "My brothers brought me out here. They left me." The silence that followed was so complete that Clara could hear the fire crackling in the stove and the wind battering against the cabin walls. When she finally gathered the courage to look at the man again, his face had gone hard as stone. "They what?" he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "They do not want to take care of me anymore," Clara explained, the words tumbling out now that she had started. "Our father died and he left everything to them, and they think I am a burden. So they brought me up into the mountains and they left me there to die in the storm." She was crying openly now, unable to stop. "Thomas said maybe I would find my way back and maybe I would not, but either way, it was not their problem anymore." The man stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. He paced to the window and stared out at the storm, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. When he spoke again, his voice shook with barely controlled anger. "Family does not do that," he said. "I do not care how hard times are or how much of a burden someone thinks you might be. Family does not leave their own to die in the cold. That is murder, plain and simple." His words hit Clara like a physical blow, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. Her brothers had tried to murder her, had decided that her life was worth less than the cost of her upkeep. And this stranger, this man whose name she did not even know, was more outraged on her behalf than she had allowed herself to be. "I am Quincy Henderson," the man said, turning back to face her. "I run a small spread about 5 miles from here, but I keep this line shack stocked for when I am working the northern pastures. I came up yesterday to check on some strays before the storm hit, and I was heading back to the main ranch when I saw you in the snow." He crossed his arms over his chest. "And you are Clara Zimmerman," she replied, wiping at her tears with the corner of the blanket. "The ranch is just outside Prescott, or it was. I suppose it belongs entirely to my brothers now." Quincy's expression softened slightly. "Well, Miss Zimmerman, you are safe now. This storm is going to blow for at least another day, maybe 2, but we have plenty of food and firewood. Once it clears, I will take you into town, and we will figure out what to do about your brothers." Clara nodded, exhaustion suddenly crashing over her like a wave. The warmth of the cabin and the security of being rescued had drained away the last of her adrenaline, leaving her feeling hollow and weak. Quincy must have seen it in her face because he moved to the door. "You rest," he said. "I need to see to my horse and make sure the wood pile is secured. I will be back in a few minutes." He pulled on his coat and hat and stepped out into the storm, and Clara let her eyes drift closed. She was asleep before he returned. When Clara woke, the cabin was dim with evening light filtering through the single window, and the storm outside had not lessened in intensity. Quincy sat at a small table, cleaning a rifle with practiced efficiency, but he looked up when he heard her stir. "How are you feeling?" he asked, setting the rifle aside. Clara took inventory of her body and was relieved to find that the numbness had receded from her hands and feet, replaced by a painful tingling that at least indicated the blood was flowing properly again. "Better," she said. "Warmer." "Good. You were in bad shape when I found you. Another hour and you would not have made it." Quincy stood and moved to the stove, where a pot was simmering. "I have got stew. Nothing fancy, just beans and salt pork, but it will fill your stomach." He ladled the stew into 2 bowls and brought one to Clara, along with a spoon. She sat up carefully, keeping the blanket wrapped around herself, and accepted the food gratefully. It was simple fare, but it tasted like heaven, and she ate with an appetite she had not felt in months. Quincy sat in his chair and ate his own portion, not speaking, just letting her recover in peace. When they had both finished, Clara worked up the courage to ask the question that had been nagging at her. "Why did you come this way? You said you were heading back to your ranch, but if your ranch is 5 miles from here, would not you have gone in a different direction?" Quincy looked uncomfortable for the first time since they had met. "I heard something," he admitted, "or thought I did. A voice on the wind, maybe, or just a feeling that something was wrong. I told myself I was being foolish, that nobody would be out in weather like this, but I could not shake it. So I rode in the direction of that feeling, and that is when I found you." He shook his head. "I do not usually put stock in that sort of thing, but I am glad I listened this time." "So am I," Clara said quietly. "I prayed, you know. When I thought I was going to die, I prayed that someone would find me, that I would not just freeze to death alone in the snow. I suppose God was listening after all. Or maybe your guardian angel was working overtime," Quincy said with a slight smile, the first Clara had seen from him. It transformed his face, making him look younger and less severe. "Either way, you are here now, and that is what matters." They talked as the evening wore on, carefully at first, and then with growing ease. Clara learned that Quincy had come to Arizona Territory 5 years ago from Texas, looking to start fresh after his own father had died and left the family ranch to an older brother. He had worked as a cowboy for several spreads before saving enough money to buy his own land and a small herd. It was not much, he admitted, but it was his, and he was proud of what he had built. Clara told him about her life on the ranch, about how she had kept house for her father and brothers, tended the garden, cooked the meals, and mended the clothes. She had never asked for anything in return, had never thought of herself as a burden because she worked as hard as any of them, just in different ways. But after their father died, her brothers had started treating her differently, as though every bite of food she ate was a personal insult, every moment of her existence an imposition. "They resented me," she said, staring into the fire. "I could see it in their eyes, Thomas especially. He has always been hard, but after Father died, he became cruel. Michael just goes along with whatever Thomas says, and James is too young and too weak to stand up to either of them." "How old are your brothers?" Quincy asked. "Thomas is 28, Michael is 25, and James just turned 22 last month." Clara's hands tightened on the blanket. "James looked upset when they left me, but he did not say anything. He just sat there and let it happen." "That makes him just as guilty," Quincy said, his voice hard again. "Maybe more so, because he knew it was wrong and he did it anyway." Clara had no argument for that. She had wanted to believe that James, at least, cared about her, but actions spoke louder than thoughts, and his action had been to let his brothers leave her to die. The storm raged through the night and into the next day, trapping them in the cabin together. Under other circumstances, it might have been awkward. A young woman and a young man alone together without a chaperone, but Quincy was unfailingly respectful, giving Clara the bed while he slept on the floor near the stove, and maintaining a careful distance at all times. They passed the time talking, and Clara found herself drawn to this quiet man who had saved her life without hesitation, and who seemed genuinely outraged at what her brothers had done. On the second morning, Clara's dress had dried enough for her to put it back on, and she felt more like herself with proper clothes, even if they were wrinkled and still slightly damp in places. Quincy cooked breakfast, frying up bacon and cornbread in a cast-iron skillet, and they ate while watching the snow continue to fall outside. "You think it will ever stop?" Clara asked, only half joking. "It will," Quincy assured her. "These mountain storms blow themselves out eventually. Another day, maybe 2 at most, and then we can head down." "What happens then?" Clara asked, voicing the fear that had been growing in her chest. "I have nowhere to go. I cannot go back to the ranch, and I have no money, no way to support myself." Quincy was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. "We will figure something out," he said finally. "Maybe there is work in town, or maybe someone needs a housekeeper. You are a hard worker, you will find something." But Clara could hear the doubt in his voice, could hear what he was not saying. Prescott was a small town, and jobs for single women were scarce. She might find work as a laundress or a cook, but those positions were few and often paid barely enough to survive. And there was always the danger of her brothers finding her, of them deciding to finish what they had started. The third day dawned clear and bright, the storm having finally blown itself out during the night. The world outside the cabin was transformed, buried under several feet of pristine white snow that glittered in the sunlight like a blanket of diamonds. Quincy opened the door and surveyed the landscape with a critical eye. "We can make it down today if we start soon," he said. "The snow is deep, but my horse is strong, and the way down is not as steep as the way up." Clara nodded and began gathering her things, which consisted only of her shawl and gloves since she had arrived with nothing else. Quincy saddled his horse, a sturdy bay gelding with a calm temperament, and then helped Clara mount before swinging up behind her. The journey down the mountain was slow and treacherous, the horse picking its way carefully through the snow, but Quincy guided the animal with expert hands, and they made steady progress. As they descended, Clara found herself dreading their arrival in Prescott. She had no plan, no idea what she was going to do, and the future stretched out before her like an empty void. But Quincy's presence behind her was solid and reassuring, and she clung to that feeling as they rode. They reached Quincy's ranch in the early afternoon, and Clara got her first look at the spread he had described. It was modest, as he had said, a simple wooden ranch house with a barn and several outbuildings, but everything was well maintained and sturdy. A few dozen cattle grazed in a snow-covered pasture, their dark forms stark against the white landscape. Quincy helped Clara dismount and led her into the house, which was clean but sparse, the home of a man who lived alone and spent most of his time working. There was a main room with a fireplace, a small kitchen, and what Clara assumed was a bedroom through a closed door. "Make yourself comfortable," Quincy said, moving to start a fire. "I need to check on the animals and make sure everything weathered the storm all right, but I will be back soon. There is coffee in the pot if you want some." He left before Clara could respond, and she found herself alone in his house, feeling like an intruder. She busied herself by tidying up, washing the few dishes in the sink and sweeping the floor, needing to do something useful to justify her presence. By the time Quincy returned, she had the place looking considerably better and she had coffee heating on the stove. Quincy stopped in the doorway and looked around, surprise evident on his face. "You did not have to do that," he said. "I wanted to," Clara replied. "You saved my life. The least I can do is clean your house." Something shifted in Quincy's expression, a warmth that had not been there before. "Thank you," he said quietly. "It is nice to come home to a clean house and hot coffee. I had forgotten what that was like." They sat at the table and drank their coffee, and the silence between them was comfortable now, familiar. Clara realized with a start that she had known this man for only 3 days, but it felt like much longer. There was an ease between them that normally took weeks or months to develop, a sense of understanding that went beyond words. "I have been thinking," Quincy said suddenly, setting down his cup. "About your situation, I mean. You need a place to stay and a way to support yourself, and I need help around here. The house is always a mess, and I am a terrible cook, and there is more work than I can keep up with sometimes. What if you stayed here and worked for me?" I could pay you wages, and you would have a roof over your head and food to eat. It would be a fair arrangement, all above board and respectable." Clara stared at him, hope flaring in her chest so painfully that it almost took her breath away. "Do you mean that?" she asked. "You would do that for me." "I would," Quincy said, meeting her eyes. "But I want to be clear about something. Your brothers tried to kill you, and that is not something that can be forgiven or forgotten. If you stay here, if you work for me, they might come looking for you eventually. They might cause trouble. I need you to understand that I am willing to face that trouble, but you need to be willing too." Clara thought about her brothers, about Thomas's cold eyes and Michael's indifference and James's cowardice. She thought about the ranch where she had grown up, the place that should have been her home but had become a prison. And then she thought about this man who had risked his life to save hers, who had shown her more kindness in 3 days than her brothers had shown in 3 months. "I am willing," she said firmly. "I am not afraid of them anymore. They had their chance to kill me and they failed. I will not let them control my life any longer." Quincy smiled, that rare expression that transformed his face, and held out his hand. Clara took it, and they shook on the agreement like business partners, like equals. But the warmth of his hand in hers sent a shiver through Clara that had nothing to do with the cold, and when their eyes met, she saw something in his gaze that made her heart beat faster. The weeks that followed fell into a comfortable rhythm. Clara threw herself into making Quincy's house a home, cleaning and organizing and cooking meals that were far superior to anything he had been making for himself. She mended his clothes and tended the kitchen garden that had been neglected, planning what she would plant come spring. Quincy worked the ranch, tending his cattle and repairing fences, and doing all the 100 small tasks that came with running a spread, even a small one. They ate their meals together, and in the evenings, they sat by the fire and talked about everything and nothing. Quincy told her stories about his time as a cowboy, about cattle drives and wild horses and nights spent under the stars. Clara told him about the books she had read, the few her father had owned, and the ones she had borrowed from the minister's wife in town, and about her dreams of someday traveling beyond Arizona territory, of seeing the ocean and the big cities back east. "Maybe you will," Quincy said one evening as they sat with coffee and watched the fire crackle. "Maybe we both will someday." The way he said, "we" made Clara's pulse quicken, made her wonder if he felt the same pull she did, the same awareness that something was growing between them that had nothing to do with employment or convenience. She caught him watching her sometimes when he thought she was not looking, his dark eyes intense and thoughtful, and she knew she watched him the same way, admiring the strength in his hands and the kindness in his face. Winter gave way to early spring, and the snow began to melt, revealing the brown earth beneath. Clara planted her garden, kneeling in the dirt and pressing seeds into the soil with careful precision, and Quincy worked on repairing the barn roof that had developed a leak during a late-season storm. They worked in companionable silence, aware of each other in a way that was becoming impossible to ignore. It was Quincy who broke the tension one evening in late March. They had just finished dinner, and Clara was washing dishes while Quincy dried them, a routine they had fallen into that felt domestic and right. He set down the dish he was drying and turned to face her, his expression serious. "Clara," he said, and something in his tone made her set down the plate she was washing and give him her full attention. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to be honest with me about how you feel." Her heart was pounding now, and she wiped her wet hands on her apron. "All right," she said softly. Quincy took a deep breath, as though steadying himself. "When I found you in that snow, I thought I was just saving a life, doing what any decent person would do. And when I brought you here and offered you work, I told myself it was a practical arrangement, something that benefited us both. But somewhere along the way, things changed for me. You changed them." He reached out and took her hand, his touch gentle but firm. "I have fallen in love with you, Clara. I think I started falling that first night in the line shack when you cried about what your brothers did, and I have not stopped falling since. I know it is fast, and I know we have not known each other that long, but I also know what I feel. And I need to know if you feel anything for me too, or if I am just fooling myself." Clara felt tears spring to her eyes, but they were good tears, happy tears. "You are not fooling yourself," she whispered. "I love you too, Quincy. I think I have for weeks now, but I was afraid to say anything. I thought maybe you saw me as just an employee, someone you saved out of pity." "Never pity," Quincy said fiercely. "Admiration, yes. Respect, absolutely. And love, so much love I do not know what to do with it all." He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away her tears. "I want to marry you, Clara. I want you to be my wife, not my employee. I want to build a life with you, have children with you, grow old with you. But only if that is what you want too." "It is," Clara said, her voice breaking with emotion. "It is everything I want." Quincy kissed her then, soft and gentle at first, and then deeper as Clara wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him back with all the love and longing that had been building inside her for months. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Quincy rested his forehead against hers and smiled. "We will do this right," he said. "I will talk to the minister, and we will have a proper wedding, and I will make you the happiest woman in Arizona territory if it takes me the rest of my life." "You already have," Clara said, and kissed him again. They were married 3 weeks later in the small church in Prescott, with the minister and his wife as witnesses. Clara wore a simple blue dress that the minister's wife had helped her make, and Quincy wore his best suit, the one he had bought in Texas before coming west and had worn only twice. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt, and when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Quincy kissed Clara with such tenderness that the minister's wife dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. As they left the church, Clara saw a familiar figure standing across the street, watching them. James, her youngest brother, stood alone in the shadow of the general store, his face pale and troubled. Their eyes met for a long moment, and Clara felt a surge of conflicting emotions. Anger, yes, for what he had allowed to happen, but also sadness, for the brother she had once loved and who had chosen his older brothers over doing what was right. Quincy followed her gaze and tensed, his hand moving instinctively to her waist in a protective gesture. But James did not approach. He simply stood there for another moment and then turned and walked away, disappearing around the corner of the building. "Are you all right?" Quincy asked quietly. Clara took a deep breath and nodded. "I am," she said, and realized it was true. James had made his choice and she had made hers. She was Mrs. Quincy Henderson now, and her future was with the man beside her, not with the brothers who had betrayed her. They spent their wedding night in the ranch house, which Clara had decorated with wildflowers she had picked that morning. Quincy carried her over the threshold, and they made love for the first time with all the awkward tenderness of two people learning each other's bodies, learning how to move together and please each other. It was sweet and passionate and perfect, and afterward they lay tangled together in the sheets, Quincy's hand stroking her hair while Clara traced patterns on his chest. "I used to think my life was over that day in the snow," Clara murmured. "I thought I was going to die alone and forgotten and nobody would care." "I would have cared," Quincy said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "If I had been too late, if I had not found you in time, I would have cared. The world would have lost something precious, and I would have lost the woman I was meant to love." "Do you really believe that?" Clara asked, tilting her head back to look at him. "That we were meant to find each other? I do," Quincy said without hesitation. "I believe you were sent into that storm so I could find you, so we could have this life together. Maybe that makes me a romantic fool, but I do not care." "It makes you my romantic fool," Clara said with a smile, and kissed him until they both forgot about everything else except each other. The months that followed were the happiest of Clara's life. She threw herself into being a rancher's wife, learning everything Quincy could teach her about cattle and horses and the land. She helped with the branding in the spring and rode out with him to check the herds in the summer. The garden she had planted flourished under her care, providing them with fresh vegetables, and she learned to preserve food for the winter, canning and pickling with the skill her mother had taught her before she died. Quincy expanded the ranch bit by bit, buying more cattle when he could afford them and hiring a couple of hands to help with the work. Clara cooked for the ranch hands and made sure they had clean clothes and decent meals, and they treated her with respect and gratitude, tipping their hats to her whenever they passed and calling her Madam in tones that held genuine regard. In late autumn, Clara realized she was pregnant. She told Quincy one evening after supper, taking his hand and placing it on her still flat stomach. "We are going to have a baby," she said, watching his face carefully for his reaction. Quincy's eyes went wide, and then a grin spread across his face so wide and joyful that Clara started laughing. He swept her up in his arms and spun her around, both of them laughing like children, and then he set her down gently, as though suddenly afraid he might hurt her. "A baby," he said, his voice full of wonder. "We are going to have a baby. Clara, do you know what this means? We are going to be a family. A real family." "We already are a family," Clara said, cupping his face in her hands. "But yes, now we will be 3 instead of 2. Quincy knelt down and pressed a kiss to her stomach, right where their child was growing, and Clara felt tears prick her eyes at the sight of this strong man being so gentle, so full of love for a baby he had not even met yet. The winter was mild that year, nothing like the terrible storm that had nearly killed Clara the year before, and she was grateful for that as her pregnancy progressed. Quincy fussed over her constantly, insisting she rest more and work less, but Clara ignored most of his demands and continued to do her share of the work, knowing that women had been having babies while running households for centuries, and she would be no different. Their son was born on a warm day in June 1882, with the minister's wife attending as midwife since Prescott did not have a doctor. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Clara thought she might die just as her mother had, but she gritted her teeth and pushed with everything she had. And finally, after hours of agony, she heard the sharp cry of a newborn baby. "It is a boy," the minister's wife announced, laying the squalling infant on Clara's chest. "A healthy boy with good lungs." Clara looked down at her son, at his tiny red face and waving fists, and felt love so overwhelming that it took her breath away. Quincy came in from where he had been pacing outside, his face pale with worry, and when he saw Clara holding their child, his expression transformed into pure joy. "A son," he breathed, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed. "We have a son. What should we name him?" Clara asked, stroking the baby's soft head. Quincy thought for a moment, his finger gently clasped by the baby's tiny hand. "Matthew," he said. "Matthew Henderson. It was my grandfather's name, and he was a good man." "Matthew," Clara repeated, testing the name. "I like it. Matthew Henderson." They baptized him a month later in the same church where they had been married. And as the minister anointed their son with water and spoke the words of blessing, Clara felt a sense of completeness she had never known before. This was her family now, Quincy and Matthew, and nothing her brothers had done could touch this happiness. But Clara should have known that peace never lasts forever, not in a place as wild and untamed as Arizona Territory in the 1880s. It was a hot day in August when Thomas and Michael rode onto the ranch. Clara was hanging laundry in the yard, Matthew sleeping in a basket in the shade nearby, when she heard the sound of horses and looked up to see her two oldest brothers approaching. Her heart lurched in her chest, and she immediately moved to stand between them and her baby, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. Thomas pulled his horse to a stop a few yards away and dismounted, Michael following suit. They looked harder than Clara remembered, leaner and meaner as though the past year and a half had not been kind to them. "Clara," Thomas said, his voice flat. "We need to talk." "We have nothing to talk about," Clara said coldly. "You tried to kill me. You left me in the mountains to freeze to death. I have no brothers anymore." "That was a mistake," Thomas said, though he did not sound apologetic. "We were desperate and we did a stupid thing, but you survived and now you have got all this." He gestured around at the ranch, at the house and barn and pastures. "Looks like you landed on your feet just fine." "No thanks to you," Clara spat. "I survived because a good man found me and saved my life. I survived because Quincy Henderson is 10 times the man any of you will ever be." Michael shifted uncomfortably, but Thomas's expression hardened. "We did not come here to argue," he said. "We came because the ranch is failing. The cattle are dying and we cannot make the mortgage payments. We are going to lose everything." "And that is my problem how?" Clara demanded. "You are sitting on plenty," Thomas said, his voice turning ugly. "Married to a man with land and cattle and money, you could help us, but you are too selfish." Clara laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "You think I owe you something after what you did to me? You must be out of your mind." "We are family," Michael said quietly, speaking for the first time. "Family helps each other." "Family does not leave each other to die in a blizzard," Clara shot back, throwing Quincy's words from that first day back at them. "You lost any claim to being my family when you rode away and left me in the snow. Now get off my land before my husband comes back from the north pasture and throws you off." Thomas took a step forward, his face flushing with anger, and Clara tensed, ready to fight if she had to. But before anything could happen, the sound of a rifle being cocked froze everyone in place. "I think the lady made herself clear," Quincy said, his voice calm but deadly as he approached from the barn, his rifle leveled at Thomas. "You boys need to leave, and you need to do it right now." Thomas turned to face Quincy, his hand dropping to the gun at his hip, but Quincy did not flinch. "I would not do that if I were you," he said. "I am a fair shot, and at this distance I will not miss. And even if you get me, my ranch hands are in the barn and they are armed too. You will not make it off this property alive." As if to punctuate his words, 2 men emerged from the barn, both holding rifles, their faces grim. Thomas looked from Quincy to the ranch hands and back again, calculating his odds and clearly not liking what he found. "This is not over," Thomas said finally, his voice low and threatening. "Yes, it is," Clara said firmly. "It has been over since the day you left me to die. Now leave and do not ever come back. If I see you on my property again, I will shoot you myself." Thomas and Michael mounted their horses, and for a moment, Clara thought Thomas might try something stupid anyway. But he must have seen the determination in her face and the unwavering aim of Quincy's rifle, because he finally jerked his reins and rode off, Michael following behind him. They disappeared down the road in a cloud of dust, and Clara felt her knees go weak with relief. Quincy lowered his rifle and immediately went to her, pulling her into his arms. "Are you all right?" he asked urgently. "Did they hurt you?" "I am fine," Clara said, though she was shaking. "They wanted money. They said the ranch is failing and they wanted us to help them." "Not a chance in hell," Quincy said fiercely. "Those men do not deserve a single cent from you, not after what they did." If they lose that ranch, it is their own fault for being too stupid and too cruel to deserve it. The ranch hands approached cautiously, and Quincy thanked them for their help. "Keep an eye out for the next few days," he told them. "I do not think they will come back, but I want to be sure. If you see anyone suspicious around the property, you come get me immediately." The men nodded and headed back to their work, and Quincy turned his attention to Matthew, who had slept through the entire confrontation. He picked up the basket and carried it inside, Clara following close behind. Once they were in the house with the door firmly closed, Clara allowed herself to break down, the fear and adrenaline catching up with her all at once. Quincy held her while she cried, murmuring reassurances into her hair, and when she finally calmed down, he tilted her face up to look at him. "They cannot hurt you anymore," he said firmly. "You are my wife, and Matthew is my son, and I will protect you both with everything I have. Do you believe me?" "I believe you," Clara whispered, and knew it was true. Quincy had proven time and again that he would do anything for her, that his love was not just words but actions, solid and dependable as the Arizona earth beneath their feet. True to Quincy's prediction, Thomas and Michael did not return. Clara heard through the gossip in town that they had lost the ranch to the bank a few months later and had left Arizona territory altogether, heading to California to try their luck there. James, she learned, had stayed behind and was working as a hired hand for another rancher, too ashamed to show his face in Prescott much anymore. Clara felt no sympathy for any of them. They had made their choices, and now they were living with the consequences. She had her own life to focus on, her own family to care for, and she was not going to waste time mourning brothers who had never truly loved her. The years passed peacefully after that. The ranch prospered under Quincy's steady management and Clara's hard work, growing from a small spread to a respectable operation that employed half a dozen hands year-round. Matthew grew from a baby into a sturdy toddler, and then a bright, energetic boy who followed his father everywhere and worshipped the ground his mother walked on. When Matthew was 3, Clara gave birth to twin girls, Sarah and Emma, who arrived squalling into the world with matching red faces and strong lungs. Quincy was beside himself with joy at having daughters, and he proved to be just as doting a father to the girls as he was to Matthew. The house that had once seemed too large and empty was now constantly filled with the sounds of children playing and laughing, and Clara had never been happier. On a cool evening in October 1887, Clara stood on the porch of the ranch house and watched the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Behind her, she could hear Quincy reading a story to Matthew while the twins played with their dolls on the rug. It was an ordinary moment, the kind that happened every day, but Clara treasured it all the same because she knew how easily it could have been lost. She thought about that day in the snow, about how close she had come to dying alone and unloved in the wilderness. She thought about the miracle of Quincy finding her, of him choosing to save her when he could have just as easily ridden past. She thought about all the moments that had led to this one, all the choices and chances and small acts of courage that had built the life she now lived. Quincy came out onto the porch and slipped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly. "About how lucky I am," Clara said, leaning back against him. "About how different things could have been if you had not found me that day." "I will always find you," Quincy murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. "In this life or any other, I will always find you." Clara turned in his arms and kissed him, pouring all her love and gratitude into that simple gesture. When they broke apart, she smiled up at him, this man who had saved her in every way a person could be saved. "I love you," she said. "I love you too," Quincy replied. "Always and forever." Behind them, Matthew called out asking for another story, and the twins started giggling over some private joke only they understood. Clara and Quincy exchanged a look of shared amusement and headed back inside, back to the warm chaos of their family, back to the life they had built together from nothing but love and determination, and the simple belief that people were worth saving. The ranch continued to thrive as the years went on. By the time Matthew was 10, he was already helping with the cattle and learning to rope from his father. The twins, now 7, were inseparable and kept Clara busy with their endless energy and curiosity. Clara had taken up teaching them herself, using the books she ordered from back east and the knowledge she had accumulated over the years. In 1889, Clara gave birth to another son, whom they named Daniel. He was a quiet baby, unlike Matthew, who had been loud and demanding from day one, and he seemed content to simply observe the world around him with wide, thoughtful eyes. Quincy joked that Daniel took after Clara, calm and steady and strong in his own quiet way. The ranch now sprawled across several hundred acres, and Quincy had built a reputation as a fair and honest rancher who treated his hands well and always kept his word. Other ranchers respected him, and he had become a voice of reason during the occasional disputes that arose over water rights or grazing land. Clara, for her part, had become known as a gracious hostess and a skilled healer, using the knowledge of herbs and remedies she had learned from the minister's wife to help neighbors when they were sick or injured. One spring day, in 1891, a young man rode onto the ranch asking for work. Clara was in the garden when she heard the commotion and looked up to see Quincy talking to the newcomer near the barn. Something about the young man's posture seemed familiar, and as Clara walked closer, she realized with a start that it was James, her youngest brother. He looked different than she remembered, older and more weathered, with lines around his eyes that spoke of hard living. But it was definitely James, and when he saw her approaching, his face went pale. "Clara," he said hoarsely, "I did not know this was your ranch." "I would not have come if I had known." Clara studied him for a long moment, this brother who had once been her playmate and companion before their father died and everything fell apart. She could feel Quincy's eyes on her, waiting for her cue on how to handle this. "Why are you here?" she asked finally. James looked down at his hands, twisting his hat brim nervously. "I heard Henderson Ranch was hiring and I need work. Thomas and Michael have been gone for years, out in California somewhere, and I have just been drifting from ranch to ranch, trying to make a living." He finally met her eyes, and Clara saw genuine remorse there. "I am sorry, Clara, for what we did to you, for not standing up to them when I should have. I was young and stupid and scared, and I have regretted it every day since." "Sorry does not change what happened," Clara said quietly. "Sorry does not change the fact that you sat there and watched them leave me to die." "I know," James said, his voice breaking. "I know, and I do not expect you to forgive me, but I wanted you to know that I am sorry and that I am glad you survived and that you found happiness. You deserve that after everything we put you through." Clara felt Quincy's hand settle on her shoulder, a silent gesture of support, and she drew strength from his presence. "Can you work hard?" she asked James. "Can you take orders and do your share without complaint?" James looked startled by the question. "Yes," he said quickly. "I can. I am a good hand, I swear it." "Then you can stay," Clara said, making the decision in that moment. "You will work like everyone else, and you will be paid like everyone else, and we will not speak of the past again. But if you ever give me reason to regret this, if you ever do anything to threaten my family or my home, you will leave and never come back. Do you understand?" "I understand," James said, and there were tears in his eyes now. "Thank you, Clara. You are a better person than I will ever be." "I am," Clara agreed without false modesty, and turned to walk back to the house. Behind her, she heard Quincy assign James to one of the bunkhouses and put him to work mending fences, and she knew her husband would keep a close eye on her brother to make sure he kept his word. Over the following months, James proved to be a reliable worker, quiet and diligent, never causing trouble or asking for special treatment. He treated Clara with a respect that bordered on reverence, tipping his hat to her whenever they passed, and always addressing her as Madam, the way the other hands did. He was good with the children, especially Matthew, who enjoyed having an uncle to teach him rope tricks and tell him stories about cattle drives. Clara never fully forgave James for what he had done, but she found that she could live with his presence on the ranch without the anger that had once consumed her. He had been young and weak when their brothers left her to die, but he had grown into a decent man, and that counted for something. The years continued to roll by, marked by the changing seasons and the rhythms of ranch life. Matthew grew into a fine young man, tall and strong like his father, with his mother's sharp mind and kind heart. The twins became beautiful young women who were courted by half the eligible bachelors in Prescott, much to Quincy's consternation. Daniel remained the quiet one, but he had a gift with horses that amazed everyone who saw him work. In 1897, Clara and Quincy celebrated their 15th wedding anniversary with a party that brought together friends and neighbors from all over the territory. The house was filled with music and laughter, and as Clara danced with her husband in the lantern-lit barn, she marveled at how far they had come from that desperate day in the snow when he had found her and changed her life forever. "What are you thinking?" Quincy asked, echoing the question he had asked so many times over the years. "I am thinking that I am the luckiest woman alive," Clara said, resting her head on his shoulder. "I am thinking that being left to die was the best thing that ever happened to me because it led me to you." "That is a dark way of looking at it," Quincy said with a chuckle, but his arms tightened around her. "But I know what you mean. I found my purpose that day, found the reason I was put on this earth. It was to find you, to save you, and to love you for the rest of my life." "Mission accomplished," Clara murmured, and they danced until the music stopped and their children pulled them apart to dance with them instead. The new century arrived with its promise of change and progress, but on the Henderson ranch, life continued much as it always had. Matthew took over more of the daily operations as Quincy's knees started to ache in the cold, and his back complained after long days in the saddle. The twins both married good men and moved to nearby ranches, but they visited often with their own children, filling the house with a new generation of laughter and chaos. Daniel, true to his quiet nature, stayed on the ranch and became indispensable, the one everyone turned to when there was a problem that needed solving. James worked on the ranch until 1903, when he finally saved enough money to buy a small piece of land of his own. He came to Clara before he left, hat in hand, and thanked her for giving him a chance when he did not deserve it. "You saved my life too," he said simply. "Maybe not the way Quincy saved yours, but you gave me a purpose and a place when I had neither. I will never forget that." Clara embraced him then, the first time she had willingly touched him since before their father died, and wished him well. She never saw Thomas or Michael again, and she did not care to. Some wounds ran too deep to heal, some betrayals too severe to forgive. But James had done his best to make amends, and that was enough. As Clara grew older, her hair turning silver and lines etching themselves around her eyes and mouth, she never lost the gratitude she felt for the life she had been given. She had started with nothing, abandoned and left for dead by the people who should have protected her, but she had built something beautiful from those ashes. She had a husband who loved her beyond reason, children and grandchildren who filled her days with joy, and a legacy that would outlast her. On a quiet evening in the spring of 1909, Clara sat on the porch of the ranch house with Quincy beside her, their hands clasped together the way they had been for nearly 30 years. Matthew was running the ranch now, doing a fine job of it, and the grandchildren were playing in the yard, their shouts and laughter carrying on the breeze. "You ever regret it?" Quincy asked suddenly. "Taking me up on my offer all those years ago, marrying a cowboy with more dreams than sense?" Clara turned to look at him, at this man who had ridden through a blizzard on nothing but a feeling, and had saved her life in every way that mattered. His hair was white now, and his face was weathered from years of sun and wind, but his eyes were still the same dark eyes that had looked at her with such concern and compassion when he pulled her from the snow. "Never," she said firmly. "Not for a single moment. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Quincy Henderson, and I would do it all again in a heartbeat." Quincy smiled, that rare smile she had fallen in love with all those years ago, and leaned in to kiss her. "Good," he said, "because I am not done loving you yet. I figure I've got at least another 30 years in me, and I plan to spend every one of them showing you how much you mean to me." "That sounds perfect," Clara said, and settled back against his shoulder, watching the sun set over the mountains and feeling profoundly, completely at peace. When Clara passed away in the winter of 1925 at the age of 64, surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, her last words were for Quincy, who sat beside her bed holding her hand just as he had held it through every trial and triumph of their life together. "Thank you for finding me," she whispered. "Thank you for letting me," Quincy replied, his voice thick with tears. And then she closed her eyes and slipped away peacefully, secure in the knowledge that she had been loved completely and had loved completely in return, that her life had mattered and had meant something, and that the legacy she left behind was one of courage and resilience, and the unshakable belief that family was not about blood, but about the people who chose to stand beside you when the whole world turned its back. Quincy followed her 3 years later, dying quietly in his sleep at the age of 71. He was buried beside Clara on a hill overlooking the ranch they had built together. And at his funeral, Matthew spoke about how his father had always said that finding Clara in that blizzard was the moment his real life had begun, and everything before it had just been waiting. The Henderson Ranch continued to thrive for generations, passing from Matthew to his children and then to their children, each generation adding their own chapter to the story while never forgetting the foundation that Clara and Quincy had laid. The tale of how Clara had been abandoned by her brothers and saved by a cowboy who believed that family did not do that became legend in Prescott. A reminder that sometimes the worst moments of our lives are actually the doorway to our greatest blessings, and that love can grow in the most unlikely places if we are brave enough to reach for it.